when a ruthless billionaire, CEO, humiliated a single dad janitor in front of her board of directors, calling his beat-up classic Mustang a worthless piece of junk. She thought she was just putting a peasant in his place. She had no idea that beneath the rusted hood of that filthy car sat a $2 billion prototype, one that was about to bankrupt her entire empire. This is the story of the ultimate revenge, fueled by a father's love, corporate greed, and an engine that changed history. The mop squeaked against the Italian marble floors of the Apex Innovations lobby, a repetitive, hollow sound that echoed through the cavernous, glass-walled atrium. It was 2 a.m. in downtown Seattle, and while the city's tech elite slept in their high-rise penthouses, Dean Masterson was hard at work erasing their footprints. Dean was 38, though the deep lines etching the corners of his eyes made him look 10 years older. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit with "maintenance" stitched over the left breast pocket, a stark contrast to the sharp, tailored suits that occupied this building during daylight hours. To the executives and engineers at Apex Innovations, one of the world's leading automotive tech firms, Dean was entirely invisible. He was just the guy who emptied the recycling bins, scrubbed the toilets, and restocked the espresso machines. They didn't know that Dean's hands, currently calloused and raw from industrial bleach, used to draft aerospace schematics. 5 years ago, Dean hadn't been holding a mop. He had been a rising star in mechanical engineering, holding 2 master's degrees from MIT. He had a beautiful wife, Sarah, and a bright, giggly 3-year-old daughter named Chloe. But life has a cruel way of stripping a man down to his barest bones. When Sarah was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, the experimental treatments had drained their savings within months. When his boutique engineering firm went under because he spent every waking moment at his wife's hospital bedside, the medical debt swallowed their home, their assets, and their future. Sarah passed away on a rainy Tuesday, leaving Dean with $2 million in medical debt and a daughter who had inherited her mother's beautiful green eyes, along with a severe chronic respiratory condition that required expensive daily medication. Desperate for immediate health insurance to keep Chloe breathing, Dean had taken the first union job he could find that offered full medical benefits: night janitor at Apex Innovations. It was a brutal fall from grace, but Dean swallowed his pride every single night. He would scrub every floor in Seattle if it meant his little girl got her inhalers. But Dean hadn't let his mind rot. While the world thought he was just pushing a broom, he was secretly building the future. Deep in the bowels of the Apex Innovations headquarters, down in sub-level 4 of the parking garage, sat Dean's only remaining possession from his past life, a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429, or at least the shell of one. To the untrained eye, the car was an absolute tragedy. Its original grabber blue paint was sun-baked and peeling like a bad sunburn. The right fender was dented, the chrome bumpers were heavily pitted with rust, and it sat on 4 mismatched steel wheels. It looked like a junkyard reject, an ugly iron ghost hiding in the darkest corner of the concrete bunker. The previous building manager, an old, sympathetic man named Hank, had quietly allowed Dean to keep the car parked in a dead-end maintenance bay near the boiler room, far away from the sleek luxury vehicles of the executives. But Hank had retired 2 months ago, and the culture at Apex Innovations had sharply shifted under its new leadership. The company was now run by Vivian Carmichael. Vivian was 32, notoriously ruthless, and the heiress to the Carmichael fortune. She had taken over Apex Innovations after her father's passing and immediately transformed the culture from one of engineering curiosity to cutthroat corporate vanity. Vivian was obsessed with image. She wore $5,000 designer suits, exclusively drank imported bottled water, and drove a pristine, custom-ordered electric hypercar that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. To Vivian, everything was about aesthetics and market valuation. She didn't care about the science, she cared about the stock price. And currently, Apex Innovations was promising its shareholders a revolutionary leap in electric vehicle technology. A solid-state battery propulsion system that was supposedly going to make lithium-ion obsolete. The only problem was, Vivian's engineering team was secretly failing. Their prototypes kept overheating, and the company was quietly hemorrhaging billions in R&D, trying to fix a fundamental physics problem they couldn't crack. Dean knew this, because Dean emptied their trash cans. He saw the crumpled schematics, the angry red marker corrections on the whiteboards, the failed thermal degradation reports left carelessly on desks. He saw the exact thermodynamic wall the Apex engineers were hitting. And more importantly, Dean knew how to fix it. In fact, he already had. Every night after finishing his cleaning route at 4 a.m., Dean would retreat to sub-level 4. He would lock the chain-link fence behind him, pull out a battered set of tools, and work on his rusted Mustang. But he wasn't restoring a classic V8 engine. Beneath the peeling hood of that 1969 relic was something that didn't belong in this decade, let alone this century. He was using the heavy steel chassis of the Mustang as a camouflaged test bed for his own propulsion system. It was his sanctuary, his secret laboratory, and his ticket to saving his daughter's future. All he needed was a few more weeks to finalize the patent filing and complete the safety simulations. He just needed to stay invisible. But invisibility, Dean was about to learn, is a fragile thing when you share a building with a billionaire who despises anything less than perfection. The disaster struck on a Thursday evening, during the Apex Innovations annual shareholder gala. The building was swarming with venture capitalists, tech journalists, and Wall Street executives. Vivian Carmichael, draped in an immaculate white evening gown, was leading a VIP tour of the facility. She was desperate to keep the investors dazzled, terrified that they would sniff out the delays in her highly anticipated Project Vanguard engine. To distract them, she had decided to showcase her personal collection of exotic electric vehicles. The problem was, she had chosen sub-level 4 for the display. Dean was in the middle of mopping the elevator lobby on sub-level 3 when his radio crackled. It was the shift supervisor, barking orders. "Masterson, get down to sub-level 4. Someone spilled champagne near the VIP display. Move now." Dean grabbed his yellow mop bucket and hurried to the freight elevator. His heart pounded a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Sub-level 4 was strictly off-limits tonight. Or so he thought. As the heavy metal doors slid open, the sound of classical string music and wealthy laughter echoed off the concrete pillars. The dingy, fluorescent-lit garage had been transformed. High-end catering tables lined the walls, and multicolored LED spotlights illuminated Vivian's fleet of multi-million-dollar hypercars. But Dean's eyes darted past the catering and the cars, landing straight on the far corner. His stomach dropped, because the VIP tour route had expanded. A group of wealthy investors led by Vivian Carmichael herself was walking right past the boiler room maintenance bay, right past Dean's car. He had covered the Mustang with a heavy gray canvas tarp to hide its rusted exterior, but it stood out like a sore thumb against the backdrop of sleek, polished concrete and neon lights. It looked like a corpse, draped in a sheet. "Ah, and over here," Vivian's sharp, commanding voice rang out. "We have—" She paused, her perfectly manicured eyebrows knitting together in disgust as she stared at the gray lump in the corner. "What in the world is this?" Dean froze, his hands gripping the handle of his mop so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to speak, to intercept her, but the unwritten rule of his job paralyzed him. "Do not speak to the executives unless spoken to." Richard Belmont, a prominent Wall Street venture capitalist with a billion-dollar portfolio, chuckled, sipping his champagne. "Looks like you're hiding a dinosaur in your electric utopia, Vivian." Vivian's face flushed with irritation. She hated being embarrassed, especially in front of Richard Belmont. She marched over to the tarp, her diamond-studded heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Excuse me! You! Janitor!" Vivian snapped, spotting Dean standing frozen with his mop bucket. "Is this your mess?" Dean slowly walked forward, feeling the eyes of 20 billionaires burning holes into his cheap uniform. "Ms. Carmichael, that's my vehicle. The previous manager, Hank, gave me permission to park it in the dead zone." Vivian let out a scoff of pure disbelief. She grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas tarp and violently yanked it backward. The tarp slid off, revealing the 1969 Mustang in all its rusted, faded, dented glory. Under the harsh gallery spotlights Vivian had set up, the car looked even worse than usual. The peeling grabber blue paint looked like a skin disease. The pitted chrome and mismatched wheels screamed of poverty. A collective murmur of amusement and disgust rippled through the crowd of investors. Someone actually took out their phone and snapped a picture, laughing. "You have got to be kidding me," Vivian sneered, stepping back as if the car might infect her. She turned her piercing gaze to Dean. "You parked this piece of junk in my executive facility during my shareholder gala." "I apologize, Ms. Carmichael," Dean said, keeping his voice carefully level, though his jaw was locked tight. "I'll cover it back up. It's not in the way of the display." "It is a blight on my entire building," Vivian interrupted, her voice raising an octave, echoing off the concrete. She was performing for the investors now, showing her dominance. "This company represents the pinnacle of human engineering. We are building the clean energy future, and you drag this leaking, gas-guzzling, rusted scrap metal into my headquarters. That car is junk. It's an eyesore. It is a symbol of everything Apex Innovations is trying to destroy." Dean looked at the Mustang, then back at Vivian. "It's not leaking, ma'am, and it's not what you think it is." "I don't care what you think it is," Vivian hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to Dean, her expensive perfume choking him. "Listen to me very carefully, mister." She glanced at his name tag. "Masterson, you have exactly 24 hours to get this garbage heap off my property. If this rusted piece of trash is still in my building by midnight tomorrow, I will have it crushed into a cube, and you will be fired. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, like a guillotine blade. Fired. If he was fired, he lost his union health insurance. If he lost the insurance, Chloe's asthma medication, which cost $3,000 a month, would stop. Vivian wasn't just threatening his car. She was threatening his daughter's life. All because her aesthetic sensibilities were offended. Dean's blood boiled. The urge to fire back, to tell this arrogant heiress exactly who he was and what was sitting under that rusted hood, roared in his mind. He wanted to pop the latch. He wanted to show Richard Belmont and the rest of the board that the garbage heap they were laughing at held the technological holy grail they were currently burning billions trying to find. But he couldn't. His patents hadn't cleared yet. If he revealed the engine now on Apex property, Vivian's army of corporate lawyers would find a loophole, claim intellectual property theft, since he built it on their premises, and steal his life's work. He had to swallow the poison. He had to play the peasant. Dean lowered his head, forcing his eyes to the floor. "I understand, Ms. Carmichael. I'll have it moved by tomorrow night." Vivian scoffed, turning her back on him with a dramatic swish of her gown. "See that you do. Now clean up this floor. It reeks of cheap labor." She turned back to the laughing investors, immediately switching on a radiant fake smile. "Right this way, gentlemen. Let me show you the new aerodynamic renders for Project Vanguard." Dean stood there in the shadow of his mocked creation, listening to the laughter fade down the corridor. He picked up his mop. He wiped the floor. But inside, the invisible man was dead. A quiet, cold fire had just been ignited. 24 hours, Dean whispered to himself, looking at the rusted hood of the Mustang. That's all we need. The following night, the Apex Innovations building was blissfully silent. The gala was over, the champagne flutes had been cleared away, and the executives had retreated to their mansions. A relentless Seattle rain battered the glass exterior of the skyscraper, but down in sub-level 4, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Dean Masterson. It was 11 p.m. He had exactly 1 hour before Vivian Carmichael's deadline expired. Dean stood in front of the 1969 Mustang. He didn't have on his blue janitorial jumpsuit tonight. He wore a heavy leather mechanic's jacket and a pair of grease-stained jeans. He reached down to the grill of the Mustang, found the hidden release lever, and pulled. The heavy steel hood popped with a loud metallic clack. Dean lifted it, securing the prop rod. The harsh fluorescent lights of the garage poured into the engine bay, illuminating a sight that defied all logic and expectation. There was no greasy, oil-leaking V8 iron block. There were no carburetors, no spark plugs, no rubber fuel lines, and no exhaust manifolds. Instead, nestled perfectly within the reinforced steel shock towers of the classic muscle car, sat a masterpiece of modern engineering. It was a massive, sleek, geometric enclosure machined from aerospace-grade titanium and cobalt blue anodized aluminum. Thick braided high-voltage cables pulse-routed out of a central, glowing core. It looked like the beating heart of a starship, cold, beautiful, and terrifyingly advanced. This was the Masterson core. For the last 3 years, Dean had taken every cent of his meager janitorial salary that didn't go to Chloe's care, every discarded piece of scrap tech from the Apex dumpsters, and every ounce of his MIT genius, and poured it into this bay. The Apex engineers on the 40th floor were failing because they were trying to force chemical solid-state batteries to operate within traditional thermal parameters. They were trying to build a better battery. Dean had realized years ago that the battery wasn't the problem. The transfer of energy was. He had designed a continuous-loop electromagnetic induction motor paired with a hyper-dense, zero-heat solid-state array. The Mustang's heavy 1960s steel chassis wasn't just a shell. It was a necessary grounding cage. In the early days of testing, the immense torque and magnetic fields generated by the prototype would have ripped a modern, lightweight carbon fiber chassis to shreds. The Boss 429 was heavy, brutal, and made of Detroit steel. It was the perfect Trojan horse. Dean pulled a specialized diagnostic tablet from his duffel bag and plugged a heavily modified data cable into a hidden port near the firewall. The tablet screen flared to life, cascading lines of complex telemetry and thermal data. Core. Temp. 18 degrees Celsius. Stable. Magnetic containment. 99.8%. Stable. Energy density. Output. 4.2 megawatts. Stable. Dean's thumb hovered over the final command prompt. His heart raced. He had tested the components individually 1,000 times. He had run the simulations on stolen server time while the IT department was asleep. But he had never fully initiated the closed-loop system. He had never turned the key. If his math was off by even a fraction of a percent, the resulting thermal runaway would melt the car down to the concrete and likely take a good portion of sub-level 4 with it. He thought of Vivian Carmichael's sneering face. "That car is junk! It's an eyesore!" He thought of Chloe, sleeping at his sister's apartment across town, clutching her inhaler. "Not junk," Dean whispered. "A revolution." He pressed the execute button on the tablet. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The garage was dead silent, save for the dripping of a leaky pipe in the corner. Dean held his breath, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. Did the induction coil fail? Did the relay short? Then he felt it. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a feeling. The concrete floor beneath his heavy work boots began to vibrate. a deep, subsonic tremor that traveled up his legs and rattled his teeth. The hairs on Dean's arms stood straight up as the air in the garage suddenly became heavily ionized, tasting faintly of ozone and impending lightning. Then came the sound. It wasn't the guttural mechanical roar of a classic muscle car. It was a smooth, rising, electromagnetic hum. A deep, resonant whir that sounded like a jet turbine spooling up inside a vacuum. The cobalt blue aluminum casing in the engine bay began to emit a soft, pulsing light, matching the rhythm of the power surging through the continuous loop. The tablet in his hand beeped frantically. System online. Output efficiency, 104%. Thermal loss, 0.01%. Dean stared at the screen, his breath hitching in his throat. 104%. The induction loop was feeding energy back into the solid-state array faster than the motor was drawing it at idle. It was virtually a perpetual power cycle. It didn't just work. It exceeded his wildest theoretical models. He had just rendered every internal combustion engine and every current lithium-ion electric vehicle on the planet completely obsolete. Sitting right here under the rusted hood of a car a billionaire had threatened to crush was a propulsion system worth easily $2 billion to any major automotive manufacturer. Suddenly, the heavy metal doors of the freight elevator clanged loudly across the garage. Dean's head snapped up. The elevator doors slid open, and two Apex Innovations corporate security guards stepped out, flanked by the night shift manager. They were holding flashlights, scanning the dim perimeter of sub-level 4. "Masterson!" the manager yelled, his voice echoing over the deep hum of the Mustang. "It's 11:55. Miss Carmichael left strict orders. If that piece of crap isn't out of the gates in 5 minutes, we're locking the wheels and calling the tow company." Dean looked down at the glowing, futuristic heart of his machine, and then slowly reached up and pulled the rusted heavy steel hood down. It latched with a sharp click, hiding the $2 billion secret back in its ugly iron prison. The sound of the engine was heavily muffled now, reduced to a low, barely perceptible purr that easily blended in with the building's boiler room ambient noise. Dean unplugged his tablet, shoved it into his bag, and walked around to the driver's side door. The handle squeaked as he pulled it open. He tossed his bag into the passenger seat, which was torn and held together with duct tape. He slid behind the cracked wooden steering wheel. There were no digital screens in the cabin, no fancy touch interfaces, just the classic analog dials he had painstakingly rewired to read the quantum outputs. He rolled down the window and looked out at the security guards approaching his vehicle. "I'm leaving," Dean said, his voice calm, devoid of the subservient tone he had used for the last 3 years. "You're damn right you're leaving," the manager sneered, tapping his flashlight against the Mustang's rusted fender. "Don't bother coming back for your shift tomorrow, Masterson. Ms. Carmichael told HR to terminate your contract. She doesn't want insubordinate trash in her building. Hand over your key card." Dean's jaw tightened. They were firing him anyway. Vivian Carmichael couldn't even wait the full 24 hours. She was cutting off Chloe's health insurance, just out of spite. Dean reached into his pocket, pulled out the white plastic Apex keycard, and dropped it onto the cold concrete floor. "Pick it up," the manager barked. "Clean it up yourself," Dean replied softly. "I don't work here anymore." Before the manager could yell again, Dean reached down to the modified transmission shifter. He didn't rev the engine. He didn't peel out in a cloud of smoke. He simply shifted into drive and let off the heavy brake pedal. The 1969 Mustang lurched forward with terrifying silent violence. The instant torque of the electromagnetic motor hit the rear wheels with such immediate, devastating force that the massive tires didn't even have time to squeal. They just violently gripped the concrete, launching the heavy steel car forward like it had been fired from a railgun. The security guards yelped, leaping out of the way, as the rusted blue blur rocketed past them. In less than 2 seconds, Dean was at the top of the exit ramp. The boom barrier at the gate didn't open fast enough. The Mustang shattered it into plastic splinters without even slowing down. Dean shot out into the rainy Seattle night, the wet streets reflecting the streetlights as he vanished into the city. Back in the garage, the manager and the security guard stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the junk car had been. Did you hear that?" one of the guards whispered, trembling slightly. "That didn't sound like an engine." The manager looked down at the shattered boom barrier on the street level. "I don't know what the hell that was, but it's not our problem anymore. Good riddance." They had no idea that they had just watched the salvation of their company drive away in a rusted shell. And Dean Masterson knew exactly what his next move was. He wasn't just going to secure his daughter's future. He was going to make Vivian Carmichael wish she had never walked into sub-level 4. The morning sun clawed its way through the overcast Seattle sky, casting a gray, unforgiving light over the city. Dean Masterson sat in the driver's seat of the Mustang, parked in a deserted industrial lot near the docks. He had barely slept. His mind was a chaotic spreadsheet of dwindling numbers. He had exactly $214 in his checking account. Chloe's asthma medication refill was due in 5 days, and without the Apex corporate insurance, the out-of-pocket cost was $3,200. Time wasn't just money anymore. It was oxygen. Dean pulled his cracked smartphone from his pocket. He brought up the photo he had snapped of the VIP guest list from the Apex shareholder gala. His finger scrolled past the names of tech moguls and real estate tycoons until it stopped on the man who had laughed at his car. Richard Belmont. Belmont was a titan in the venture capital world. His firm, Belmont and Hayes Capital, controlled over $80 billion in assets, specializing in aggressive, high-risk tech acquisitions. He was ruthless, brilliant, and, most importantly, he had first-hand knowledge of Vivian Carmichael's failing Project Vanguard. He knew the market was desperate for a savior. Dean started the Mustang. The electromagnetic core whirred to life, silent and deadly. He didn't have time to navigate the slow, bureaucratic channels of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He needed a shark. 40 minutes later, the rusted 1969 Boss 429 pulled up to the pristine, circular driveway of the Belmont and Hayes skyscraper in downtown Seattle. The head valet, a young man in a crisp red vest, stepped forward, his face twisting in immediate disgust. "Sir, delivery vehicles are around back. You can't park this thing here." "I'm not a delivery driver," Dean said, stepping out of the car. He wore his only clean piece of clothing, a faded gray button-down shirt and a pair of dark slacks. He tossed the keys to the valet. "Park it, and don't scratch the rust." Before the valet could protest, Dean walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, all polished granite and brushed steel. Dean marched straight to the reception desk. "I need to see Richard Belmont," Dean said to the receptionist. She didn't even look up from her monitor. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Masterson? Dean Masterson." "And no, I don't. But tell him the janitor from sub-level 4 at Apex Innovations is here. And I brought the dinosaur." The receptionist finally looked up, her eyes scanning Dean's cheap clothes. She was about to call security when a voice boomed from the mezzanine balcony above. "Wait." Richard Belmont stood at the glass railing, holding a cup of coffee. He was impeccably dressed in a navy Brioni suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He stared down at Dean, his eyes narrowing in recognition. He had been on his way to the elevators, but the mention of Apex Innovations had stopped him. "Send him up, Sarah," Belmont called down. "Let's see what the help has to say." 10 minutes later, Dean sat in a leather chair that cost more than his entire life savings, facing Richard Belmont across a massive mahogany desk. "I remember you," Belmont said, leaning back, lacing his fingers together. "You're the guy Vivian Carmichael publicly castrated 2 nights ago. Tell me, Masterson, why shouldn't I have security throw you out of the nearest window?" Dean didn't flinch. "Because you have $3 billion tied up in electric vehicle infrastructure stocks, Mr. Belmont. And Vivian Carmichael's Project Vanguard is a fraud. Her solid-state engines are suffering from critical thermal degradation. They overheat at sustained high voltages. They are hitting a physical wall they cannot engineer their way out of." Belmont's amused smirk vanished. He sat up straight. "How the hell do you know that?" "I empty their trash," Dean said flatly. "I read the discarded thermodynamic reports. But more importantly, I know how to fix it." Belmont let out a harsh laugh. "A janitor knows how to solve a thermal physics problem that a team of 200 PhDs can't crack. Get out of my office. I hold dual master's degrees from MIT in mechanical and electrical engineering." Dean fired back, leaning forward. "I lost my career when my wife died and medical debt bankrupted me. I took the cleaning job for the health insurance to keep my daughter alive. I'm not a janitor, Mr. Belmont. I am the man who just made the internal combustion engine extinct." The room went dead silent. Belmont stared at Dean, searching his eyes for the lie. He found nothing but terrifying, desperate conviction. "Prove it," Belmont challenged softly. "Look out your window," Dean replied. Belmont stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the street. Down below, parked illegally on the curb because the valet refused to touch it, was the rusted 1969 Mustang. "You want me to invest in that piece of scrap?" Belmont asked, bewildered. "I want you to come for a ride," Dean said, standing up. "Bring your engineers. Bring your telemetry scanners. If I'm lying, you can have me arrested for trespassing. But if I'm right, you pay to expedite my patent filing today. You fund my daughter's medical trust, and we take Vivian Carmichael off the board entirely." Belmont looked at the rusted car, then back at the intense, hollowed-out man standing in his office. The billionaire's predatory instincts flared. "Give me 10 minutes, Belmont said. 2 weeks later, the walls were closing in on Vivian Carmichael. The executive boardroom of Apex Innovations felt like a pressurized tomb. The panoramic views of the Seattle skyline offered no comfort to the 12 nervous board members sitting around the glass table. At the head of the table, Vivian stood, gripping a laser pointer so tightly her knuckles were white. "The leaks are contained," Vivian lied, her voice tight and defensive. "The thermal variance in the latest Vanguard prototype is well within acceptable safety margins." Acceptable margins?" interrupted David Cho, the largest institutional shareholder in the room. He slammed a manila folder onto the table. "Vivian, your lead engineer's test rig caught fire yesterday during a closed-loop simulation. The fire suppression system couldn't even put it out because the solid-state array went critical. The Wall Street Journal is running an expose tomorrow morning calling Vanguard a billion-dollar bonfire." Vivian's face flushed red. "It was an isolated calibration error. Apex stock is down 40% in pre-market trading," Cho roared, standing up. "You promised us a revolution, Vivian. You promised us an engine that would crush Tesla and Rivian. Instead, you've burned through $4 billion of R&D capital, and we have absolutely nothing to show for it." Vivian swallowed hard, the suffocating grip of panic closing around her throat. She had inherited a pristine empire from her father, and in 3 years, she was on the verge of bankrupting it because she refused to admit her engineers had failed. "We need a strategic acquisition," Vivian said, shifting tactics. "If we can't build it, we buy it. We acquire a startup with functional tech, slap the Apex logo on it, and the shareholders back off." "Buy what?" Cho scoffed. There is nobody in the market who has solved the energy density issue without triggering a thermal event. It's physics, Vivian. Not according to the whispers coming out of Silicon Valley, interjected a quiet, older board member at the end of the table. Vivian's eyes snapped to him. What whispers? Richard Belmont, the board member said. My contacts at Belmont and Hayes say he just aggressively patented a new propulsion system, a closed-loop electromagnetic induction core. They're calling it the Masterson core. The rumor is it operates at zero heat with an energy density triple anything on the market. If it's real, it's the holy grail. Vivian felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. Richard Belmont, the man she had tried to impress at the gala, the man who had mocked her electric fleet. Has he gone public? Vivian asked, her voice trembling slightly. No, he's keeping it under wraps, but if we don't get to him first, he'll license it to Ford or GM, and Apex Innovations will be completely obsolete by Q3. Vivian didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone from the table. I'll call Belmont. I will offer him double whatever he put into it. We buy this Masterson core, absorb the patent, and save Vanguard. She stormed out of the boardroom, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. She retreated to her private office, slamming the door, and dialed Belmont's private number. He picked up on the second ring. Vivian, I was wondering when you'd call. His voice dripped with casual arrogance. Cut the crap, Richard, Vivian snapped, pacing the length of her office. I know about the induction core you're funding. I want to buy the startup. Name your price. It's not a startup, Vivian. It's a private patent holding, and it's not for sale. But my partner might be willing to discuss an exclusive licensing agreement, for the right percentage, of course. I want to see it, Vivian demanded. I need my engineers to verify the telemetry. If it solves my thermal issues, I will write you a check that will make your head spin. I thought you might say that, Belmont chuckled. Bring your checkbook and your lead engineers to the private airstrip out in King County. Tomorrow noon. Don't be late. My partner is very particular about punctuality. The line went dead. Vivian stared at her phone, a vicious smile creeping onto her face. She was going to survive this. She just needed to throw enough money at Belmont's mysterious partner. The private airstrip in King County was a massive stretch of pristine black tarmac surrounded by dense towering pine trees. A heavy gray overcast sky threatened rain, casting a dramatic cinematic gloom over the runway. At exactly 11:50 a.m., a sleek, black luxury helicopter descended from the clouds, touching down near the edge of the tarmac. The side door slid open, and Vivian Carmichael stepped out, wearing a sharp black designer trench coat. She was followed by her two lead engineers, both clutching heavy silver briefcases packed with diagnostic equipment. 100 yards down the runway, Richard Belmont stood leaning against the hood of his black SUV, sipping coffee from a thermos. Vivian marched across the tarmac, the wind whipping her hair. "Richard," she greeted sharply. "Where is it? Where is the prototype?" Belmont smiled, pushing himself off the SUV. "Relax, Vivian. He's coming." "I don't have time for theatricality," Vivian snapped, looking at her diamond-studded watch. "My board is threatening a vote of no confidence. I need to see this Masterson core, operational, and I need to see the patent paperwork." "Oh, you'll see it," Belmont said, pointing down the runway. From the far end of the 2-mile airstrip, a vehicle turned onto the tarmac. It was moving slowly at first, a distant speck against the gray horizon. Vivian's engineers raised their binoculars. Is it a modified chassis?" Vivian asked impatiently. "A carbon fiber test bed." The vehicle drew closer. The shape became distinct. The harsh, aggressive lines of a 1960s muscle car cut through the humid air. Vivian's breath hitched. Her blood ran ice cold. It was the 1969 Boss 429 Mustang. The same rusted, dented, peeling grabber blue monstrosity she had humiliated in her parking garage 2 weeks prior. It rolled toward them, but it didn't rumble. It didn't roar. It emitted a terrifying, deep, electromagnetic whine that vibrated the fillings in Vivian's teeth. "Richard, what is this?" Vivian whispered, taking a step back as the Mustang pulled to a halt exactly 10 feet in front of her. This, Vivian," Belmont said, gesturing grandly to the rusted car, "is the future of human transportation and the end of your company." The driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a faded blue janitorial jumpsuit. He wasn't holding a mop. Dean Masterson wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. His hair was neat, his posture straight, and the heavy, exhausted bags under his eyes were gone, replaced by a gaze of cold, absolute authority. Vivian's jaw literally dropped. She recognized the face, but her brain violently rejected the reality of the situation. The janitor?" she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You're Belmont's partner." "Dean Masterson," Dean said, his voice calm, echoing slightly over the empty tarmac. "MIT class of 2011. And yes, I am the sole patent holder of the Masterson electromagnetic induction core." This is a joke!" Vivian gasped, turning to Belmont. "This is some kind of sick joke. He's a garbage man." "He's a genius," Belmont corrected sharply, dropping his amused facade. "While your team was burning billions trying to reinvent the battery, Dean here built a perpetual induction loop in your basement, using your company's scrap metal. We ran the diagnostics yesterday, Vivian. Zero thermal emission, infinite scalability. He didn't just beat Project Vanguard, he slaughtered it." Vivian felt the world spinning, the billions in R&D, the shareholder panic, the crushing humiliation. It was all culminating in this rusted piece of metal she had threatened to crush into a cube. "Check the telemetry," Dean said, nodding to Vivian's engineers. The engineers didn't wait for Vivian's permission. They rushed forward, plugging their diagnostic scanners into the port Dean had wired near the grill. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the tarmac as the engineers stared at their screens. "Well?" Vivian demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. The lead engineer looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Miss Carmichael, the energy density, it's impossible. It's generating 4.2 megawatts at idle, and the core temperature is sitting at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. There is no thermal waste. None." "Liar!" Vivian screamed, losing all pretense of corporate composure. She marched up to the Mustang, staring at the peeling blue paint. "You stole this. You built this on Apex property, which means Apex owns the intellectual property. I'll sue you into the ground." Dean didn't blink. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal document, stamped with the golden seal of the USPTO. "Actually," Dean said smoothly, "because you technically fired me and officially ordered me to remove my junk from your premises before midnight, you legally severed my employment contract before I activated the closed-loop system. My lawyers, paid for by Mr. Belmont, ensured the filing reflects that the prototype was finalized off-site." Dean took a step closer to Vivian, his height towering over her. The sweet taste of vindication was potent, but he kept his voice deadly quiet. "You called this car a piece of trash," Dean said. "You threatened my livelihood, which threatened my daughter's life. You told me this car was an eyesore." Dean gently patted the rusted hood of the Mustang. "But under this hood is the proprietary technology that I'm about to license to your biggest competitor for $2 billion. By Monday morning, Apex Innovation stock will be worth pennies. Your board will fire you, and your legacy
will be the CEO who threw out the greatest invention of the 21st century because it didn't match her aesthetic.
The helicopter ride back to the Apex Innovations headquarters was suffocatingly silent. Vivian Carmichael sat rigidly in her leather seat, staring out the window at the sprawling Seattle metropolis. Though she saw none of it, her mind was a violent storm of panic, rage, and denial. The image of that rusted, peeling 1969 Mustang sitting on the airstrip, humming with the power of a flawless electromagnetic core, burned behind her eyes. $2 billion. Dean Masterson, the invisible man who scrubbed her floors, had built a $2 billion empire in her own basement, and she had literally thrown him out the door. As soon as the helicopter touched down on the roof of the Apex Tower, Vivian stormed to her private office, ignoring her assistants and the frantic emails piling up from her board of directors. She slammed the heavy oak doors shut, locked them, and picked up her secure private line. She didn't call her lead engineers, and she didn't call her public relations team. She called Victor Harrington. Victor was a shadow in the corporate world, a high-priced fixer who specialized in hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and burying inconvenient problems for the ultra-wealthy. He wasn't a man who played by the rules of the United States Patent Office. He played by the rules of leverage. Vivian. Victor's voice came through the receiver, smooth and chillingly calm. I saw the pre-market numbers for Apex. You are bleeding out. What do you need? I need you to destroy a man, Vivian hissed, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. His name is Dean Masterson. He's a former employee. He's claiming ownership of a propulsion patent that rightfully belongs to Apex, and he's partnering with Richard Belmont to license it to our competitors. Belmont's lawyers have him wrapped in ironclad contracts, but there has to be a crack. Masterson was a janitor, Victor. He's white trash. Find his weakness. Find whatever it takes to break him, and do it by tomorrow morning. Consider it done, Victor replied, the line clicking dead. For the next 18 hours, Vivian paced her office like a caged panther. She refused to sleep. She drank black coffee until her hands shook. She knew that if Dean Masterson signed a public licensing agreement, Apex Innovations would be exposed. Their $4 billion Project Vanguard would be revealed as a complete failure. The stock would crash to zero, and David Cho and the rest of the board would personally see to it that Vivian faced federal fraud charges for lying about the engine's safety. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Victor Harrington walked into Vivian's office, bypassing her security detail entirely. He tossed a thick manila folder onto her glass desk. I found the crack, Victor said, taking a seat and crossing his legs. And it's a massive one. Vivian tore open the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. What is this? Medical debt, Victor explained, a cruel smile touching the corners of his mouth. Masterson isn't just a janitor. He's an MIT graduate whose wife died of pancreatic cancer 5 years ago. The experimental treatments left him with $2.4 million in debt, but that's not the best part. His daughter, Chloe, has a severe chronic respiratory condition. Without top-tier medical insurance, her treatments cost thousands a month. When you fired him, you cut off her lifeline. Vivian's eyes lit up with predatory realization. He's broke. He is drowning, Victor corrected. Belmont is fronting the legal fees for the patent, but Belmont is a shark. He hasn't given Masterson any actual liquid capital yet because the licensing deal hasn't closed. Masterson's bank account currently holds less than $300. He has creditors breathing down his neck, threatening to seize his remaining assets. Heck, if he goes bankrupt, Vivian whispered, tracing a manicured finger over the debt collection notices. Child Protective Services could argue he is unfit to provide critical medical care for his daughter. Exactly, Victor said. So, last night I made a few phone calls. Through a shell company, I purchased the entirety of Dean Masterson's $2.4 million medical debt from the collections agency. You now own it, Vivian. You own him. You can call the debt in today. You can freeze his accounts, drag him into court, and initiate proceedings that will alert child services. By the end of the week, his daughter will be in a foster home. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless laugh. The suffocating weight on her chest finally lifted. She didn't need to beat Dean Masterson's engine. She just needed to threaten the only thing he loved more than his invention. "Set up a meeting," Vivian commanded, her eyes burning with ruthless triumph. "Neutral ground. Tell Belmont and Masterson that I am ready to concede, but I want to negotiate a settlement face to face. Just the three of us." 3 hours later, Dean Masterson and Richard Belmont sat in the private dining room of an exclusive, members-only club in downtown Seattle. The mahogany table between them was polished to a mirror finish. The doors swung open, and Vivian Carmichael walked in. She was dressed in a blood-red designer suit, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance. She didn't bring her lawyers. She didn't bring her engineers. She sat directly across from Dean, looking at him not as a brilliant inventor, but as the peasant she had always believed him to be. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Vivian said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table toward Dean. Dean looked down at it. It was a notice of immediate debt collection. The creditor listed was a subsidiary holding company, solely owned by Vivian Carmichael. The amount due, $2,450,000. Dean's face went pale. The confident, authoritative posture he had carried on the airstrip vanished, replaced by the hollow, terrified look of a father backed into a corner. He looked up at Vivian, his jaw clenched. "What is this?" Richard Belmont demanded, snatching the paper. He read it, his eyes narrowing. "Vivian, this is illegal coercion. You bought his dead wife's medical debt." "I made a sound financial investment," Vivian replied smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "Dean owes my subsidiary $2.4 million, payable immediately. Since I know for a fact he does not have that money, I will be filing for immediate asset seizure this afternoon. That includes his rusted Mustang and, unfortunately, any pending intellectual property associated with him." Vivian leaned forward, locking eyes with Dean. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "But the money isn't the real issue, is it, Dean? The real issue is your daughter, Chloe. I have already drafted a letter to the State Department of Child and Family Services. A bankrupt, unemployed father living in a dangerous tax bracket cannot possibly provide the complex medical care a chronically ill child requires. They will take her, Dean. She will be a ward of the state by Friday." Dean's hands began to shake. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "You leave my daughter out of this. She has nothing to do with your failing company." "She has everything to do with it!" Vivian snapped, her facade of calm breaking into pure, vicious desperation. "You humiliated me. You tried to destroy my legacy. Now I am giving you a choice. You sign the Masterson core patent over to Apex Innovations. You walk away with nothing and you go back to scrubbing floors somewhere else. In exchange, I will forgive the debt and Chloe stays with her father. You have 60 seconds to decide." The room was deathly quiet. Belmont looked at Dean, a flash of genuine concern crossing the billionaire venture capitalist's face. Dean stared at the polished mahogany table. He thought of his late wife, Sarah. He thought of the thousands of hours he spent in the freezing basement of Sub-Level 4, coughing on dust, building the engine that was supposed to save them. He thought of Chloe's smile. Slowly, Dean reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek silver pen. Vivian smiled, a cold, victorious smirk. She pushed a patent transfer agreement across the table. Dean held the pen over the signature line. His hand trembled. "That's right, Masterson," Vivian sneered softly. "Sign it. And remember who really runs this city." Dean held the pen a millimeter above the paper. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the tremor in his hand completely fade. Then he looked up at Vivian. The terror in his eyes was gone. The pale, defeated posture evaporated. He slowly clicked the pen closed and placed it down on the table, sliding the transfer agreement back toward her. "No," Dean said. Vivian's victorious smile shattered. "Excuse me. Did you not hear a word I just said? I will take your daughter." "You're not going to take anyone, Vivian," Richard Belmont interrupted, leaning back in his chair and pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. He looked entirely too relaxed. "Because you and your fixer, Victor Harrington, made one critical, fatal miscalculation when you decided to play in the mud." Vivian's eyes darted between the two men. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. "What are you talking about?" "When Dean came to my office 2 weeks ago," Belmont explained, swirling the water in his glass, "I didn't just verify his engine. I verified his background. I knew about the medical debt. I knew about Chloe's condition. And unlike you, Vivian, I don't use shell companies to buy debt for blackmail. I use my wealth to build walls around my investments." Dean reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder of his own, tossing it onto the table in front of Vivian. "Open it," Dean said coldly. Vivian's hands shook as she opened the folder. Inside was a legal decree from the federal bankruptcy court, dated 3 days prior. "While you were busy panicking over Project Vanguard catching fire," Dean said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "Mr. Belmont's legal team expedited a retroactive bankruptcy restructuring for my estate. He paid the principal balance of the medical debt directly to the hospital network through an anonymous philanthropic trust. The debt you bought from the collections agency, it's ghost paper, Vivian. It was legally discharged before you even wired the money. You own nothing." Vivian stared at the court decree, the words blurring together. The blood drained from her face. No, Victor assured me the debt was active. Victor Harrington is a bottom feeder who didn't bother to check the federal ledger." Belmont laughed harshly. "But wait, Vivian, it gets so much worse for you." Belmont pulled his smartphone from his pocket, tapped the screen, and placed it on the table. A high-definition audio recording began to play. "You own him. You can call the debt in today. You can freeze his accounts, drag him into court, and initiate proceedings that will alert child services." It was Victor Harrington's voice, followed by Vivian's own malicious response. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Did you really think a man who built a perpetual electromagnetic induction motor inside a 1969 Mustang wouldn't know how to clone a cell phone?" Dean asked, his eyes burning with years of suppressed anger. "When you fired me, you forgot to revoke my administrative access to the Apex internal Wi-Fi network. I've been listening to every call routed through your executive office for the last 48 hours. I recorded your conversation with Harrington." You wiretapped me," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "That's illegal." "So is corporate extortion and threatening to weaponize state child services," Belmont shot back, his voice turning lethal. "But that's a matter for the authorities. We have more pressing business." Dean reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound contract already stamped and notarized. He didn't slide it to Vivian. He just held it up so she could see the heavy, embossed logo on the cover. It was the logo for Global Motors, the largest automotive conglomerate on the planet. At 8 a.m. this morning, while you were plotting how to steal my daughter," Dean said, his voice dropping to a low, crushing register, "I signed an exclusive, irrevocable licensing agreement with William Stanton, the CEO of Global Motors. The Masterson Corps, is officially their property for the next 20 years. The acquisition price was $2.4 billion. Vivian Carmichael stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt violently. $2.4 billion. Global Motors, the rival company she had sworn to crush. They are holding a press conference in exactly 10 minutes to announce the death of the lithium-ion battery. Dean continued, relentlessly driving the nail into her coffin. And unfortunately for you, Vivian, William Stanton hates you almost as much as I do. He anonymously forwarded my audio recording of your extortion attempt, along with the Vanguard thermal failure reports I salvaged from your trash, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Vivian's phone suddenly began to vibrate violently on the table. It was David Cho, the lead board member. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again. You should probably answer that, Belmont suggested with a grim smile. With a trembling, lifeless hand, Vivian answered the phone and put it on speaker. Vivian! David Cho's voice screamed through the tiny speaker, frantic and enraged. Where the hell are you? The SEC just kicked in the glass doors of the lobby. They have federal warrants. They're seizing the Vanguard servers. The stock just halted trading because it dropped 60% in 5 minutes. Global Motors just announced a zero-heat induction engine. What is going on? Vivian couldn't speak. Her throat was constricted, her perfectly curated world collapsing into ash around her. She looked at Dean Masterson, the man she had called a peasant, the man she had ordered to clean up champagne off her floors. I told you, Dean said softly, staring her down. That car wasn't junk. Dean stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Belmont stood beside him. We're done here, Dean said. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. He paused, looking back over his shoulder at the broken billionaire sitting at the table. Oh, and Vivian, you missed a spot on your way out. The fallout was biblical. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the Seattle financial district was a war zone of news vans and federal agents. The Apex Innovations Tower, once a gleaming monument to Vivian Carmichael's ego, was surrounded by police barricades. Inside the building, the culture of cutthroat corporate vanity had violently imploded. Vivian Carmichael was escorted out of the lobby by 2 armed federal agents, her hands cuffed in front of her. Her designer suit was rumpled, her hair disheveled, and she kept her head bowed as the flashbulbs of 50 paparazzi cameras blinded her. She wasn't just fired by the board of directors. She was facing federal indictments for securities fraud, perjury, and corporate extortion. The $4 billion Project Vanguard was completely scrapped. Apex Innovations was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the week, its assets destined to be sold off in pieces to pay angry shareholders. The empire was dead. Miles away, far from the chaos of the city and the flashing lights of the news cameras, the air was clean and quiet. Dean Masterson drove along the winding coastal highway of the Pacific Northwest. He wasn't driving a rented luxury sedan, and he hadn't bought a multi-million-dollar hypercar to celebrate his newfound billionaire status. He was driving the 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. The car still looked like a junkyard refugee. The grabber blue paint was still peeling, the chrome was still rusted, and the fender was still dented. Dean had explicitly forbidden anyone from touching the exterior. The rust was a badge of honor, a reminder of the darkness they had survived. But beneath the hood, the Masterson core hummed its silent, flawless tune, propelling the heavy Detroit steel forward with terrifying, effortless grace. Sitting in the passenger seat, buckled securely into the worn leather, was Chloe. She was 7 years old, with her mother's bright green eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers. For the first time in her life, she wasn't clutching an inhaler. Thanks to the massive influx of capital, Dean had immediately secured the most advanced, targeted gene therapy treatments available for her respiratory condition. Her cheeks were flush with color, and her breathing was deep, clear, and unobstructed. "Daddy, it's so quiet," Chloe said, looking around the cabin, listening to the soft whir of the electromagnetic engine. "It doesn't sound like a monster car anymore." Dean smiled, reaching over to squeeze her small hand. "That's because it's not a monster, sweetie. It's a time machine. It brought us out of the bad times." They turned off the highway, the Mustang gliding silently up a long private driveway, lined with towering cedar trees. At the end of the driveway sat a beautiful, sprawling, modern craftsman estate, overlooking the ocean. It wasn't gaudy or ostentatious. It was warm, secure, and permanent. As they pulled up to the massive, climate-controlled glass garage attached to the house, the doors slid open automatically. Inside, there were no other cars. Just a pristine, brightly lit space waiting for its centerpiece. Dean parked the rusted Mustang in the center of the flawless white floor. He turned off the core. The low hum faded into complete, peaceful silence. He stepped out of the car, walked around to the passenger side, and lifted Chloe into his arms. She hugged his neck tightly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Are we safe now, Daddy?" she whispered. Dean looked down at the rusted, battered hood of the Mustang, remembering the freezing nights in sub-level 4, the smell of bleach, and the stinging humiliation of Vivian Carmichael's laughter. He remembered the promise he had made to his wife as she lay dying in the hospital. He kissed the top of Chloe's head, feeling her chest rise and fall with perfect, healthy breaths. "Yeah, kiddo," Dean said softly, a tear finally escaping his eye, washing away the last remnant of the invisible man. "We're safe. We're finally home." Dean's incredible journey from a mocked, invisible janitor to the architect of a $2 billion revolution proves that brilliance doesn't wear a designer suit. It wears resilience. He didn't just beat a corrupt billionaire at her own game. He changed the world to save the one person who mattered most. If this story of ultimate revenge, a father's unbreakable love, and the rusted Mustang that shocked the world inspired you, drop a like and hit that share button. Don't forget to subscribe for more epic real-life redemption stories. What would you do with a $2 billion engine? Let us know in the comments.